All right, welcome back to the Nexus Podcast. Admiral Michael Rogers, a retired four-star admiral in the U.S. Navy, is back for another visit on the podcast. Admiral Rogers is, of course, the former head of the National Security Agency and U.S. Cyber Command, and this is going to be one of our regular check-ins on the podcast with Mike. Always a good time to have a conversation like this with him and get his take on what's happening in the world of the cybers. I think it's been more than a year, Mike, since your last visit. How you doing?
It's been a while.
It's good to see you. Thanks for giving me the time, as always. I very much appreciate it. So let's start with something timely. The reauthorization of CISA 15, the Information Sharing Act, Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act 2015. The deadline for reauthorization passed. Just your take on the whole thing, and what are some of the potential risks from the failure to reauthorize this?
So first, let's talk about what this legislation provided. It provided a legal basis for a broader exchange of threat information from the federal government to the private sector around cybersecurity. So it facilitated the flow of information between the government and the private sector, specifically around cybersecurity activity of concern. So pretty significant. Lots of information flowing.
Sure.
It's a two-way street, flows both ways. Unfortunately, it expired at the end of the fiscal year, and Congress had been talking about renewing it. I think that's still their intent. I suspect what you're going to see, even though they did not renew it in time, and therefore the provision of information has shut down or at least significantly degraded. But I suspect Congress will, in fact, ultimately reauthorize it. The challenge is it's gotten caught in a broader political discussion about, what's CISA's role?
Right.
What type of information should CISA be providing? What broader set of activities should CISA be engaged in? So it's taken on a bigger context than the specifics, if you will.
It does. And what's just your take on how effective it's been and what's potentially lost here as a defender?
Right. So look, it's not a silver bullet here where I would argue this is the single greatest, element of a cybersecurity strategy, if you will. So I'm not going to say the sky is falling. This is the worst thing that could happen. But I will say, look, this was a significant benefit both to the private sector, but also because I always like the fact it facilitated a two-way flow of information. I wanted to learn as much from the private sector, every much as I did as I wanted to provide the private sector with insight, but I also wanted to learn from them.
Sure. So
I like the idea that we were moving information back and forth. So I suspect the impact of this is decreased information flow, less threat warning information coming out of the government. I'm not going to say it all stops, but there'll be less of it. And I also worry that it sends an unintended message about, maybe we believe that data flow between the two elements, government and the private sector, maybe it's just not important. And hey, if it could shut off and the sky doesn't fall, maybe we really don't need to do this. And I would, that is the wrong conclusion to draw from this.
Yeah. It's funny, though. I'm still kind of conditioned whenever I hear information sharing. I think of it as kind of almost a cliche. And I think back in the days when folks were really hesitant to share information, either competitive disadvantage or whatever. But I don't want to say we figured it out, but it's definitely a lot better than it used to be.
Oh, yeah. I think, look, there is now a fundamental acceptance very broadly of the idea that information flow from government to the private sector, which is the subject of this legislation we started talking about, as well as the private sector providing information to the government. I think there's a broad acceptance of the premise that is a positive thing. And we're not having a lot of debates like we were 5-10 years ago about, should we do this? Are we comfortable with doing this? Do we need to put limits or constraints on this? What kind of controls or oversight should be in place? Those are all very valid questions, but I think we've kind of addressed those, if you will. And now there's a view of, okay, we have a foundational strategy. We have a foundational structure here that, while it's not perfect, it works. And so let's spend our time, rather than debating about should we do it, let's spend our time focused on how might we do it in the most
Yeah.
effective way. And that's a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think with things like this, it's sometimes we forget how relatively young cybersecurity is as a practice, as an
Oh, yeah.
industry, and some of these things just need time to mature.
Look, because the biggest thing here is how do you change culture? And that all takes time. You can change the rules, change a process, but if you really want to change culture, that takes time.
So, as I mentioned at the outset, it's probably been about a year since we got together for one of these, and I
Right.
know back then we were talking about the typhoons were in the headlines and so forth, and it kind of led to some talk about deterrence in cyberspace. So I wanted to kind of touch on that a little bit with you. What does deterrence
Yeah.
mean? What does it look like to you when it comes to our adversaries? And how important is it strategically to have some type of deterrence in
So,
place?
look, clearly we haven't achieved it. If you accept the premise that deterrence is the concept that you can change an adversary's behavior, you can change an adversary's mind about their willingness to do something, you can deter them from doing something. And that deterrence, therefore, if you can change an adversary or another actor's strategic calculation and deter them from engaging activities that are of concern, for example, to the U.S., hey, that's a positive. That's been the goal. How do you shape the choices in cyber that other actors, whether they be nation states like China or Russia, whether they be criminal actors, gangs and other things, the whole idea was, well, could we get to a state where we could deter them? We could shape their calculus to the point where they concluded engaging in significant cyber activity against the United States, and by extension, governments, companies, individuals, that was not in their best interest, and therefore they weren't going to do it. We just had not achieved that. I don't think any nation in the world has managed so far to deter on a broad basis to achieve cyber deterrence, if you will. I think in part because deterrence broadly is a combination of capability and intent or will. So the capability side is, how can you convince an adversary either that your cyber defenses, cybersecurity, cyber resilience is so high that they're probably not going to succeed, or how do you convince them that your capabilities to respond to that kind of activity is such that you could make this very painful for them if they were to choose some things that you don't want, like going after your critical infrastructure systems, for example.
Right.
I always thought we weren't going to deter them on the basis of that we were going to convince them that getting into our systems was too hard. I never thought that was the way we were going to deter them. I thought our best hope for deterrence was to highlight to other nations we have the capability to respond in a like manner, or even potentially with greater capability, combined with, and I want you to understand, we have the will to do so. That if you continue down this road, we not only have the capability to respond, but we are prepared to respond. I think it's the latter portion, this idea of will or intent. That's where we just haven't done. I mean, I don't think that China, as an example, when the Chinese emplaced destructive malware in portions of the U.S. grid system, I don't think their calculus was, boy, I better not do this because the Americans could really hurt us. I just think their calculus was, well, they would potentially have the capability to hurt us. Because remember, deterrence can be in just a like manner. Just because somebody comes at you in cyber doesn't mean that your deterrence concepts need to be built around the idea of, well, it's just a cyber-like mirror response. But clearly the Chinese came to the conclusion, hey, they might have the capability, but they don't have the will. They don't have the intent, that they're not really going to use this in all these capabilities. Again, it might be cyber, it might be military, it might be economic, it might be diplomatic, that they're not going to use those capabilities against us in response to this particular act. So I don't see that dynamic changing in the immediate near term. I wish I was wrong, but I don't see that changing in the near term. Where I think we need to get our act together is in the whole idea of will and intent. You can have all the capability in the world, but if the other side doesn't believe you have the will or the intent, it doesn't mean anything.
And in the whole notion of will and intent, are we held back by our own self-imposed kind of engagement, rules of engagement?
Oh, very much so. It was always a combination of very, and they're not. There is some legitimacy to these concerns. Number one, the biggest concern always was escalation. Hey, if we respond in an aggressive manner to attempt to deter them, does that create escalatory behaviors? Do they in fact double down and say, hey, you want to get aggressive against us? We'll get even more aggressive against you. The second concern generally you would hear when we would discuss this, with the president and across the national security team's leadership in the U.S. government, as well as our counterparts in many other nations around the world. The second thing you would hear was, well, if we're more aggressive, if we respond aggressively, they will just exploit the other side. We'll just exploit the many vulnerabilities we have. Hey, they can really hurt us. We don't want to engage in this. That used to torque me off. I thought that is such BS. I mean, my attitude was, look, the analogy I would get constantly in the sit room was, Mike, we live in a glass house. And my comment was, can you tell me anybody in this hyper-connected digital world who doesn't live in a glass house? Could you explain to me why the Chinese and Russians, who, for example, China, export-based economy, highly automated shipping centers in Shanghai and other locations, Russia, which moves its hydrocarbons from the east in Siberia, where they are predominantly found, to markets at the time, to markets in the west and other areas, using highly automated transportation systems, rail and pipelines. Could you explain to me why they aren't vulnerable, why they wouldn't be concerned? They don't seem to think that, again, this goes back to this will and intent idea.
Sure.
I said, we are literally tying our hands behind our backs. This makes no sense to me. We're imposing a set of conditions that the other actors have fundamentally rejected and don't believe is applicable. But we self-impose this on us. I just always strongly disagreed with that. Now, I'm not arguing there aren't vulnerabilities. I understand that. But I just thought, why are we giving so much weight to this when that's not the way our adversaries think, and they're taking advantage of this?
What would it take to change that mindset? I mean, it always seems we're very reactive. Do we need some kind of major incident for that to shift?
Well, one thing to watch this administration and their views on, they've hinted at this a little bit, but they haven't rolled out a formal strategy yet in cyber, although they're working on it. But what you've heard them hint at is this idea of, we believe that the government should focus on that which it is uniquely positioned to do within cybersecurity. And that's really the offensive kind of cyber activities that only the government really is structured to do. And this administration has talked about, we want to put more emphasis on that. Now, they're still in the midst of formulating a lot of things. You're going to see a cyber strategy roll out, hopefully by the end of the year, but in which they're going to talk about this, that they think they need to reshape the deterrence calculus of other nation states and other actors like criminal groups. And the way to do it is to highlight both our capabilities in cyber, our ability to inflict pain on others, as well as our willingness to do so in response to specific behaviors that we believe are unacceptable. An example might be, hey, some nation putting destructive malware in portions of our electrical grid. That's pretty unacceptable. I don't think there's any nation in the world that would view that as a positive development or something that should be tolerated or as something that is reasonable.
Do you think the activity of the typhoons spooked people enough, or was this kind of, I mean, it seems at the time people were kind of denouncing it as just a total change in strategy and obviously aggression on China's part.
Right. So I think it shows you the Chinese are more aggressive. Their risk tolerance has gotten much higher. And their belief is that now is the time to access and or put at risk significant components of critical infrastructure so that in a time of crisis or war, if that were to occur, and we all hope it never occurs, but were that to occur, they would be well placed either in the lead up to that crisis or conflict or within the conflict or crisis itself, but they'd be well placed through the use of cyber within our critical infrastructure. And the two we've highlighted so far in the Volt series, the names we've given to significant Chinese intrusions, electrical system and telecommunications backbone. The two comments I would make is, number one, this is really escalatory and we should be treating it that way, but that's not what we're doing. Secondly, if they're willing to do this within two components of our infrastructure, what makes you think that they're not doing this in other areas? My view is our situational awareness in terms of critical infrastructure and potential foreign access to it is not where it should be. I worry a little bit that we don't have the situational awareness we think we do. And that if they could do this in electrical power or in telecommunications, they're doing this in other things, other areas. And the last point I would make is to our broader friends around the world. If they're doing this to the U.S., you better believe, my opinion, they are engaged in similar activities in other nations. And the Canadians, for example, within the last 90 days have announced they've caught the Chinese in some of their infrastructure. So I would just highlight, this is not a phenomena unique to the United States. The Chinese are getting much more aggressive with a host of other nations, not just the U.S. in cyber.
Do you think we've done a good enough job communicating to defenders this kind of long game that our adversaries are playing? And I guess I'm asking in the context that so much critical infrastructure in the country is privately owned, for example. Do the decision makers there kind of understand this from a strategic standpoint?
I mean, the challenge to me always was, look, there's an intellectual understanding, but the emotional connection when you believe that things are really have the potential to go wrong, when you really are concerned that you're, in the most extreme example as a military guy, when I was concerned about the life of the men and women under my command, or I was concerned about our ability to execute the missions we've been assigned, the visceral feeling you have, the way that tends to sharpen your focus, sharpen your prioritization, drive you to a risk calculus where you're both willing to do more things and willing to accept more risk in doing it. That's the part I don't see right now. And again, I don't mean it as a criticism as much as I mean it as an observation. I mean, one of the things that I'll only speak for me that disappoints me is we are not talking much at all about the telecommunications piece. We just are not. And I'm thinking, guys, think about the implications of an adversary who's gaining access into our telecommunications backbone. That's access to content of calls, access to content of SMS text. That's access to our lawful intercept system, which we use if the government gets a court order, for example, because we're concerned about Chinese espionage in the United States. We get a court order once we identify suspects, to monitor their communications activities. We do that through the telecommunications backbone because it's a commercial backbone. So they don't use government structure. These potential, individuals that we're concerned about from an espionage or spying perspective, they're using commercial infrastructure. So we have to go to the commercial provider with a court order to say, hey, look, we need to access the activity associated with the following individuals for the following reason. I'm going, so great. So now they know who we're targeting. Now they know the criteria that we're using. Now they know the techniques we use to monitor particular individuals who we're potentially concerned about espionage or other violations of U.S. law. I'm like, guys, that is not a good thing at all. And just think about, at the moment, it tends to be it looks like it's a fairly significant espionage play, so to speak. But that same access can be used for destructive purposes. So what if they decided they wanted to go beyond, exploitation for the purposes of intelligence collection, and they decided they want to get into disruption? What if they decided they wanted to get into data manipulation, for example? There's a whole host of second and third order effects that could, not saying they are, but could happen as a result of this. And I'm going, that's why I wish we were a little louder, a little more aggressive about this.
And it always seems inevitable too, when this kind of conversation happens, that, somebody will respond, well, we must be doing it to them too. And, I don't know, maybe we are, maybe we aren't, but it always seems like too kind of casual, too trite a response, and it's kind of just brushing it off as part of the game or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, the important thing to me is less, so what are others doing, and more, so how are we going to respond to this?
Right.
So we have caught them inside our telecommunications backbone. Is that acceptable? Should it be acceptable? I would argue no, but some may view differently. My view would be we need to have a discussion about how did it happen? What are we going to do to ensure it doesn't happen again? But more importantly, in many ways, what are we going to do to stop this increased Chinese, as an example? They're not the only nation doing this, but they're probably the most aggressive at the moment.
Sure.
A set of activities around our critical infrastructure. That infrastructure that fuels our economy, that infrastructure that helps underpin our military capacities, that infrastructure that helps us as a society deal with challenges and interact with each other every day, that infrastructure that enables us to respond in time of crisis or emergency. That should really concern us.
Right. I was at Black Hat this summer, and I took in a panel discussion, and there was a researcher on the panel, and he made the point that we need to make our systems less attractive to attackers. And I don't think I've ever heard it put quite that way, but it led to a bigger discussion about resilience and so forth. I just curious what you think of kind of that characterization of that our systems may be too attractive.
Yeah, that's that idea that, and I might not use attract, again, not that it's a bad word.
Yeah.
The paradigm, I think, and you particularly see this in the criminal world. Criminals are interested in maximizing return on investment. So they want to hit as many targets as they can, as quickly as they can, and they want to move on. So it's a little bit like when the swimmers go into the water with the shark. You just want to make sure that you're faster than the man or woman next to you, because the shark will go for the slower ones generally.
Right.
You think that's your hope. And so one of the things, one of the ideas for cybersecurity, particularly against criminal groups, is, look, if you can raise your cybersecurity or your cyber resilience to a threshold where you make it harder than other potential targets, then potentially the adversary just says, hey, look, there's too much work here. I'm going to go look at another target that's easier. This is just in the too hard, and the price would be too high. It would take more time. It would take more resources. And I got better use for time and resources. Mm-hmm. So we haven't used that analogy as much with nation states, because nation states have a different calculus. And look, I say this as a guy who led was part of the team of the largest cyber exploitation structure in the U.S. government. And if it was a target that we thought had valid national security interest, that we thought was important enough that it directly related to our security and that of our friends and allies, if it took a lot of money and a lot of time, we'd focus on it.
Yeah.
Time and resources weren't the biggest driver for us. Value, if you will, was the biggest driver for us in determining our prioritizations. That's not exactly the way.
Right.
So nation states, they tend to think that way. Criminal groups, individuals tend not to think that same way.
I'm just curious, since I brought up the word resilience, I'm just curious, what does it mean to you in a cyber context? And are there good examples you could point to, either from your military experience or from, experience in the business world with some of the companies you work with today?
So resilience to me is the ability to recover quickly. Resilience to me is the ability to mitigate damage relatively quickly. Resilience to me is the ability to operate in a degraded mode or in a degraded environment where I don't have necessarily my full range of connectivity, my full range of data access, my full range of situational awareness. Now, resiliency is, from a military perspective, that is the culture we constantly pound into the military. You have got to optimize yourself to work in conditions in which you don't have complete advantage. You don't have complete knowledge. You got high rates of change. You often have to operate under degraded circumstances or with potential limitations. But we constantly train, equip our culture is optimized, but that's the environment we're going to succeed in because that's the nature of conflict once you get into it. I'm a big believer that cyber resilience is a major focus in the future. And if you want an example of how it pays off, I would argue Ukraine is demonstrating the highest level of cyber resilience I've ever seen in the face of the levels of activity that they are dealing with. It's not that they're not being penetrated. It's not that adversaries aren't able to gain access. It's that they were able to shut that access down quickly. It's that they're able to shut lateral movement down quickly. It's that they're able to shut down extraction of data quickly. It's that they're able to reconfigure your defensive strategy, your defensive schemes quickly. I think that's the future for me is, look, as both an attacker and a defender, I used to say this to the two presidents that I worked for, Trump and Obama. Sir, as an attacker, if you a good attacker, not great, a good attacker who's willing to put their focus, their time and attention, they have a high probability of successfully penetrating almost any network. I won't say all, but I say a pretty good percentage. So the idea that we are going to, with the current state of affairs, our strategy will be to make sure nobody can ever penetrate our networks, cannot access our data in an unauthorized way. Yeah. I don't think that's an achievable strategy where we are right now. I hope that changes over time, but I don't think it's really achievable where we are now. Therefore, I tried to argue resilience becomes more and more important. This idea that I'm going to make it harder for them to get in. I'm going to try to forestall their ability to get in, but I'm going to be prepared for them to get in. I'm going to create enhanced resilience. I am going to assume that despite my best efforts, there's a probability, or at least a significant chance, that an adversary is going to gain unauthorized access. In light of that, I'm going to make their life harder. I'm not just going to, I try to keep them out. Right. They got in. I don't have anything else to do. That's not a defensive strategy.
One more question about kind of adversarial tactics. How much of their activity today, specifically, in the past year or so, or even longer, is about societal impacts or making us lose trust in the government's ability to protect us, for example?
I mean, look at this whole idea of cyber as a vehicle to sow discord, cyber as a vehicle to weaken trust within societies, cyber as and when I say cyber, I mean both, the ability to penetrate networks, but also the ability to manipulate information, whether that be text, files, video, pictures. This idea that we either weaken trust in institutions and or at the same time, we try to inflame, these actors try to inflame society so that it is focused on being very divided and not necessarily coming together and achieving cohesion. It's funny. I often used to get asked, hey, what's your number one concern in cybersecurity? And I would tell people, my biggest concern in cybersecurity is not necessarily unauthorized penetrations. My biggest concern in cybersecurity, using the term more broadly, is this idea that adversaries will manipulate our cyber connectivity. Adversaries will manipulate our social media platforms. Adversaries will manipulate what we see and hear as a vehicle to sow distrust, disharmony, and discord within our society. I said, that's the thing that worries me more, because in a democratic, open society in which freedom of expression is such a core foundational right, how do you measure that desire to be completely open, let people access whatever they want, say whatever they want, share whatever they want, with this idea that, well, you've got groups and nation states out there that are trying to use those freedoms against us, to weaken us, to sow discord, to tear us apart. I think the reality is we're living in a world where we have to acknowledge that there are entities out there doing that. And so we've got to ask ourselves, what does a reasonable level of security and accuracy look like in a democratic, open society where freedom of expression is foundational? But I don't think we should just sit there and blow it off and say, well, we shouldn't do anything because we're all about just letting people say whatever they want, whenever they want. And I'm going, guys, that's not exactly true. For example, our court system has long held you have the right to express yourself, but that doesn't mean you can go into a crowded theater and start yelling fire, because by expressing that, you are endangering the health, safety, and potential lives of others. Hey, that's an unacceptable use of free speech. So
Yeah, there's
consequences. It's a tough concept. It's a hard issue in society. And this is not one we want to get wrong. This is one we got to stop and think about what does right look like.
Yeah, and it's scary how effective it seems to be sometimes, especially with the social media manipulation and disinformation stuff. So.
Yeah, I mean, when people are fundamentally questioning what is reality, think back to, 10, 20 years ago. I don't remember the concept of, well, what's reality even really being a discussion topic. Broadly, it was, well, if I saw it, if I heard it, it must have at least some form of accuracy. How accurate is a topic of discussion. But you didn't think to yourself, well, inherently it's manipulated. It's totally false. It's fabricated. It's a technological invention. It has no connection with reality. And yet those are the conversations we have all the time now.
So before we wrap up, Mike, I just had one question or a couple of questions about kind of resourcing around cyber in protecting critical infrastructure. Just curious from your experience, where are the biggest gaps? Is it, and I think it's all three. I think you're going to say all three, but is it money? Is it tech? Is it people?
The biggest issue, I would honestly say the biggest issue isn't money. First, I think our foundational problem is I think we're fundamentally flawed in our approach. At the moment, broadly, we say that it's up to the network owner to ensure their own security. And my attitude is we ought to take a tiered risk approach to this. And for those networks or systems in which the risk to society could be from a health and well-being perspective, it could be from a life and limb perspective, it could be from a national security or economic security perspective. But we should do a risk-tiered model where for those areas that represent the highest risk to the well-being, safety, and security of our citizens and our nation, we ought to shift to a very different model. And to me, that model ought to be, why aren't government and the network owner working real time 24/7 to defend that network? Why is it the government says, hey, that's your job. I will provide you situational awareness as I become aware of it, but it's fundamentally your job. Right. And oh, by the way, let me know when you run into problems. It's
a tough model.
The thing I like about Ukraine, again, one of the reasons why they've achieved such resilience is that's not the model they use. Their view was you've got to align network owner, government, and commercial sector expertise. So think about those CrowdStrikes, those Microsoft, that this ecosystem is multiple parties who are exchanging knowledge and insight and situational awareness 24/7. No, not for everything. You can't do this for everything. But for those network segments where you believe that the loss or compromise of them would have significant societal or national security impact, I would argue we need a different approach for them than we do for things that we would argue, hey, minimal risk. If it was compromised, if it was shut down, we could live with that, or we could restore it pretty quickly. It's not what we should necessarily be focused on. I just think we need to shift our approach personally.
Yeah. And, hopefully this mess in Ukraine is over with soon. And I think there's going to be some fascinating case studies coming out of this around their resilience and especially in cyber.
I agree. I sure hope so.
All right, Mike.
There's a lot to learn.
Yes, absolutely. All right, man.
All right.
Great to see you as always. Thank you so much for the time and for the excellent conversation. Appreciate it as always.
Thanks, Mike.